Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on a couple of my worm bins. They're the ones that are right here in front of us. They've got African night crawlers living in them, as you could tell from the label on there, and they're the same age because they were both launched on the same day. It's been 12 days since we last checked in on them and gave them some food, so I think they're due. So I'm going to get a glove on, I'm going to get those bins up on the bench, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. As I mentioned earlier, it's been 12 days since we last fed these little guys, and the systems are now 218 days of age, getting feed number 20 today. You can see that the bins were launched with over 1,500 worms, and at that time, that's what we thought we had in here based on everyone's estimates. We kind of just averaged everyone's guesses, and we came up with those numbers. But you know, after that much time, after approximately 31 weeks or so, you would have to guess that these worms have been busy procreating and hopefully increasing the size of their numbers in here. So that's what I generally like to believe is going on in my systems. You can see we've laid a whole bunch of fresh leafy matter out here onto the top surface, and mixed in, blends in pretty good, is what had been put in here as feeding zone indicators, a couple of coffee filters. You can see that these coffee filters have been taking a beating by being out here on the surface. Actually, this one seems to be holding up a little bit better than the other one. But they're both pretty far gone, and I've got replacements. So part of what they're getting today is a couple of these, a day's worth of coffee, as well as a replacement feeding zone indicator. And the rest of everything that they're getting is all going to be minute particle size stuff, similar to what they got last week. They're getting the last of this pulverized or flaked corn cob. So I had some corn cobs, which included the corn on the kernels, and I put it in my grinder, and I ended up with that stuff. It's in little tiny flakes. This here, this is pulverized peanut shell, and I got my worm chow. So everything that they're going to be getting is just this small particle size material, which I thought I would blend in with all of these leaves and make this collection of now nicely seasoned leaves into the foundation for their feeding today. And I do have my prepared bedding here too, which I thought we might include if we felt that the leafy matter that remains from the last check-in is insufficient. I mean, we are starting to get pretty near the capacity of these containers. I mean, that includes me typically wanting to also leave myself a little room to work in here. So we're not at capacity from, kind of from a literal point of view in terms of the material being in here filling up the containers. It's just just my point of view on it in terms of wanting to leave myself a little extra space in here to work. So I believe that this nice collection of leaves will go nicely down into the feeding area. And there's going to be probably leftovers of the shredded paper cardboard mix that we included with their feeding last time. That stuff I just figured would get blended in gradually with the rest of the material in the bin if there was still some of it remaining. And here we've got like a piece of napkin. I think besides the shredded paper and cardboard, we also laid in a few napkins at the very bottom when we first started piling in their food. That was the first thing that we put in there, was a few soiled paper towels and napkins, so we'll see a little bit of that in here as well. Here I see the stem of a pepper, and I wonder what else we'll see. I already fished one out, but here's another corn cob. Lately I've been interested in trying to help the corn cobs break down, so I'd like to start splitting these things when I encounter them. So before we forget about this one, let's also see if we can crack this one in half too. And then perhaps later on, maybe at the next check-in, we'll be able to crush them even further. In the past, my thing had always been just to leave these things to break down on their own with no help. And that in itself is kind of interesting to watch, because these things, they become so puny. And the worms do like to crawl right down inside the middle of these things to drop in there, not to drop anything in, to go nibble out the inner core. But I guess that whole idea of something being dropped was what came to mind when I spotted that little tiny spherical object over there on the very rim. I don't even know if it's visible on the camera, but it does appear to me like a worm cocoon. So I've moved it onto the tip of my finger there to see if perhaps it's a little bit more easily visible this way. I am starting to question whether we're going to need any of my prepared bedding, even though it's over here on the bench right next to me, all set to go if we decide to use it. It does almost feel to me like we might push ourselves to a point where we are so chock full of material in these systems that it would just make future maintenance of the bins a little bit difficult, you know, trying to work in such a way that you don't end up dropping everything over the edge and all over the table and on the floor. So I've allowed myself to get a little bit preoccupied there with the breaking apart of these corn cobs. And my hope is that they'll more readily get broken down by the worms by being busted apart that way, providing access to more material to the worms than what had been previously when they were still intact. I mean, all this stuff that's nice and bright and yellow is all stuff that was inaccessible to the worms, and now it's totally approachable and can also be nibbled on. So now we're going to probably see very similar stuff down here. Here's a chunk of a corn cob. This one's pretty puny, so it's kind of not fitting well in my hand. The little guy must have fallen off my glove. Let's just make sure he doesn't end up slipping in between the containers. It's my assumption that we're going to bump into some more chunks of corn cob, but these pieces are definitely a lot smaller. And I think just by I think just by being smaller, they're a little bit more difficult to handle. I'm sure if I was working with two hands here, I can possibly more easily crack these things, break them apart. See, like this one felt very easy. It was almost mushy. I was able to bust it apart much more easily than the other ones so far. So this might have been the easiest one so far. Look at that nice fat worm in there. These are African night crawlers, and given the proper conditions, they can grow to be quite huge. They can grow very long, they can grow very fat, but I think the main reason my African night crawlers generally don't grow very large in size is because of the somewhat cramped quarters that they reside in with these small bins. If I was running them in some sort of a huge tub, then chances are they'd, you know, be able to grow to larger sizes. I believe that's one of the explanations for why worms limit their size in terms of how big they grow, because they can sort of sense that they're in somewhat cramped quarters, so they don't grow increasingly large. Somehow it seemed like we've got perhaps fewer corn cobs in here. Here we go, found another one. Every now and then it feels like I do bump into one. This one is allowing me to break it in half too, but they don't all give as easily as each other. Some are a little easier to break apart than others. And in here it seemed to me like we found fewer pieces, or didn't even see any pieces of napkin or paper towel or whatever it was that was in the other system. So let's proceed to giving them their meal, which is really at this point going to be this top dressing leafy material being laid down into the feeding area. At this point I'm simply just blending in the old corn cobs that we encountered along the way with that foundation that's going to become their feeding. So let's make that happen in both systems and see if we're kind of matching each other. Today I did think that I would deviate from the whole concept of these being twins and wanting to be managed identically every time by putting one little twist in here. And just a little different from how you saw it up on the shelf. Up on the shelf you saw, you know, bin number 1 and bin number 2. I kind of switched it so from your point of view, going left to right, we got bin number 1 and bin number 2 over here. I think bin number 1, I'm going to add one additional item that I didn't make mention of earlier, and that's basically sugar. I'm curious to see if I can substitute what I see a lot of people using in their systems. They seem to have a lot of luck adding stuff like molasses into their bedding, which really gives the microbes and the bacteria and fungi something to feed on. And since I don't have any of that stuff, but I've got a whole bunch of these really old gummy bears, I thought perhaps we can introduce a little bit of that in with the feeding over here in bin number 1, and then just see if we can observe any sort of a difference between the two systems, you know. And you know, since bin number 1 is the one that's going to be receiving the gummy bears, I think that's the one that's going to receive the slightly smaller portion of coffee, because one of these does appear to have a greater amount in it. I believe this one has the greater quantity of coffee grinds in it. So why don't we give bin number 2 the somewhat greater quantity of coffee. And then usually it's here onto the coffee that we like to introduce the worm chow. I didn't flash the worm chow earlier, but this is the worm chow. So we'll sprinkle that in. And sometimes I even kind of mix it in with the coffee for whatever reason. I don't know why, but that's just what I do. And this is sort of just doing away with some stuff that's been sitting around here for a while. I had wanted to crush up the peanut shells that I had laying around, because I have found that when I go into my compost barrel, for example, outside, I'll find tons and tons of peanut shell in there, which appears to make absolutely no progress whatsoever. But I gave this a try, and it did seem like the worms reacted well to it, and they came to feast on this stuff. So that seemed like a good thing. And this other stuff right here is what remains of my pulverized corn cob. So there's not a whole lot of this, but I figured we'd give a little bit to each system, and this will, at this point, tap me out of this material. So I'm now okay, giving myself the green light to proceed with grinding up my growing collection of even more additional corn cobs that I've got. So I'll be setting some time aside to work on that in the near future. So let's see, what else? I'm wondering if perhaps we could just break away from what I mentioned earlier and go ahead and just use some of this anyway, since I've got it right here. Why not, right? I just took some old leaf bags that were outside, and they've been out there for a long time. It seemed like a shame to just throw them away, and I actually took my smaller size, easy to carry, lightweight shredder outside, and I shredded up what must have been, I don't know, maybe half a dozen of those huge leaf bags. So I've got a couple 5-gallon buckets full of shredded paper. So I do feel this need to try to do away with my shredded paper collection. So I also felt like it would be kind of nice to be able to have something onto which we can place, here in bin number 1, some of these gummy bears. So I didn't really want to go too overboard on this, even though I don't really have a good idea as far as how many I should be putting in here, but I figured I would grab about a handful of them and just sort of scatter them about over in this damp bedding, which I'm assuming is going to cause these to melt. I don't know for sure. Perhaps they'll just become gooey and then the worms will actually nibble on it. I really have no clue what to expect when it comes to these gummy bears. But I am curious to see if it's going to possibly boost up the microbe activity down here in the feeding zones, and as a result cause the worms to consume the shredded paper cardboard as well as the leaves down below more quickly than what would happen over here where we didn't add any sugar. So I do wonder what's going to become of this little test. I'm just wondering if anyone else out there has ever done anything similar. I've had these gummy bears laying around here in my wormery for the longest time, and I've always thought it would be interesting to do some sort of a test with them, and this seemed like a good place as any to give this a try. I've also thought about possibly including them in my prepared bedding to see if that might help boost a little bit of microbial life in my prepared bedding, but then that would also mean I would have to drop a little bit of castings material as an inoculant, which already, has that stuff living in it. So I'm still kicking around ideas on that, but at least here we finally get a chance to break out my collection of gummy bears and put them to use in some way down here in the wormery to see if the worms will react to them well and possibly even like them. Have you ever tried anything like that? If you're one of those experimenting types with your worm bins, and if you've ever tried anything like this, kind of processed sugar sort of stuff versus natural sugar stuff, I'm definitely curious to see what kind of results you had, or if you, maybe more importantly, if you had bad results. I should be prepared for the next check-in if I'm in for a stark realization that I never should have done it in the first place, but I figured what the heck. Seems like a pretty isolated test. If it's something that the worms don't like, I'm assuming they'll just steer clear of it. I don't imagine it, but having the potential to cause real harm to the system. I hope I'm right with that. So I'm just using these last few minutes of access to the system's contents to till up the outer edges, to examine how things look out here. All the material in these systems has such a nice fluffy light texture to it. There's something about the castings that you get from these African night crawlers. It's just so nice and light and fluffy somehow. Just to look at these worms compared to the rest of the worms in my wormery, they don't seem all that much bigger, but perhaps just because they are African night crawlers, maybe their physical build is such that it causes them to produce castings that are a little bit larger in size, I think. I'm not sure of that, but I just have this funny feeling that that might be the explanation as to why the material that they produce has this somewhat lighter, fluffier feel than all the other worms I've got. I think with the European night crawlers too, I sense it a little bit as well, in terms of their castings possibly being a little bit more fluffy when you till through the stuff than the castings of other types of worms. But I don't know, maybe it's just my imagination. I wonder if anyone else gets that same sense. I gather that from watching other people's videos when they examine their castings from their night crawler systems, how they also sometimes comment on how the material seems a little bit fluffier or different in some way than what they observe in all their other worm bins. So the only other thing that we thought we might include in here before positioning our feeding zone indicators was a fresh little top coating of leafy matter, definitely providing them with a nice generous assortment of seasoned bedding material going down into the feeding area, as well as some fresh stuff to go in there, and on the very top here a nice fresh top coating of leaves as well. Now the plastic coverings that we place out here do cause the recirculation of some moisture within our systems too this way. The material does also get a little bit of moisture coming up into it, but not a whole lot, I don't think, and that's probably the main reason it remains as leftovers But I think that was kind of nice to be able to kind of gather all that stuff up and use as a foundation for the feeding we gave them today. And I'm definitely curious, what to expect in terms of the gummy bears down here. I'm even wondering if maybe just as a reminder, in case absent-minded me just totally forgets about what we did in here today, maybe we could just leave ourselves a little bit of a reminder over here. Grab a gummy bear and position them right there in the middle as a little visual clue as to what was done in here today, just in case I get distracted and forget what we did. So I will be wanting to look at this critically the next time to see if I can observe any sort of differences in the two bins, potentially caused by the introduction of that processed sugar. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I got a couple things to take care of getting cleaned up and put away here, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.